Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating journey?
Always.
Today, we're going deep into the world of power, states, and constitutions.
Oh, it's going to be good.
And you know what? We're doing it through the lens of, get this, some Spanish political science lecture notes.
Class 4.pdf. They're fascinating. It just goes to
Oh,
show you how these concepts aren't limited to one part of the world.
right. Class4.pdf. Who knew? But seriously, these notes take us on a wild ride comparing how power has worked across different societies throughout history, ancient communities, empires, monarchies. It's all in there.
It really highlights how the modern state, the one we often take for granted, is a pretty recent invention.
Yeah, like we think of states as the normal way to organize things, but these notes remind us that humans have tried a lot of different approaches to power.
Exactly. And seeing how those older systems worked can help us understand our own systems better.
Okay, so the notes start by throwing out a bunch of different ways to define power. Like, first, there's this idea of inner power, being able to think, believe, act, and speak freely.
It's that feeling of agency, of being in control of your own destiny. But of course, even the most free individuals live within societies, which means there are always limits.
Right, you can't just do whatever you want without considering the impact on others. And that leads us to the next definition, power as an instrument.
It's the idea of power being used to influence others, kind of like tools in a toolbox. Each tool has its own purpose and its own limitations.
I like that analogy. So, a king might use religious authority as his tool, while a modern politician might use social media to sway public opinion.
Exactly. The tools of power change over time and across cultures.
Okay, then there's power over the classic top-down command and control kind of power.
Think kings, generals, CEOs, those with the authority to make decisions and direct the actions of others. But even in those hierarchies, it's not always so simple.
Oh, interesting. So there's more to power than just who's at the top of the pyramid.
Definitely. The notes talk about power as a flux, which means that power is constantly flowing and shifting between people, even within those seemingly rigid hierarchies.
So, like, think about those advisors who whisper in the king's ear. They might not have official power, but they can still exert a lot of influence.
Exactly. Or think about workers who can go on strike and bring a whole factory to a standstill. Power dynamics are much more complex than they appear on the surface.
Okay, so we've got all these different ways to define power, but where does this power come from in the first place? How do people actually get it?
Well, the notes lay out a few classic pathways: force, inheritance, divine mandate, and constitutions.
So sometimes it's just brute force. Might makes right.
Sadly, yes, that's still a factor in some cases. But even when power is seized through force, those in charge often try to legitimize their rule through other means.
Right, they might claim they have a divine right to rule or establish a new legal framework that justifies their power.
Exactly. And then there's inheritance, which is a pretty straightforward way to gain power. You're born into the right family, and boom, you're in line for the throne.
Seems simple enough, but I imagine it's not always easy to hold on to that power.
Definitely not. Those who inherit power often have to work hard to maintain it. They might need to prove their competence, appease powerful factions, or navigate complex political rivalries.
It's not just a free pass then. Okay, what about this divine mandate thing? That seems like a pretty powerful justification for ruling.
It is, especially in societies where religion plays a central role. When you can claim that your authority comes directly from God or the gods, it's pretty hard to argue with that.
Makes sense, but it seems like that kind of justification wouldn't fly as easily in more secular societies.
Right. In modern democracies, leaders might still use religious rhetoric or symbolism, but it's usually intertwined with more secular justifications for their power.
So there's been a shift away from those older forms of power based on force, lineage, or divine right.
Exactly. And that shift brings us to the rise of constitutions. This is where we start to see a fundamental change in how power is understood and legitimized.
Okay, so what's so special about constitutions? How are they different?
Well, instead of relying on might, tradition, or divine decree, constitutions represent a more rational, legalistic approach to power. They establish a set of rules and principles that everyone, even those in power, is supposed to follow.
So it's like a rule book for running a country.
You could say that. It lays out the terms of the social contract, the agreement between the government and the governed.
So constitutions are pretty much a defining feature of the modern state.
They are. But it's important to remember that even with a constitution, power dynamics are still constantly being negotiated and challenged. It's not a static system.
Right. It's not just about having the document. It's about how it's interpreted, implemented, and sometimes even amended to reflect changing social and political realities.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really interesting case study, the Mexican Constitution and its system of federalism. This is where we see how these abstract concepts of power play out in a real-world context.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into the Mexican Constitution. What's the first thing that jumps out at you from these notes?
Well, the first thing is that the Mexican Constitution, like many constitutions around the world, was influenced by external models. They weren't starting from scratch. They were looking at what other countries were doing and adapting those ideas to their own context.
Makes you wonder what those influences were, right? What models were they drawing on?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely explore further. But for now, I think there's an even more important point the notes make about the Mexican Constitution, one that might surprise you.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
Well, they emphasize that even with this brand new Constitution, things didn't magically fall into place. The Constitution didn't immediately achieve everything it set out to do.
So putting those lofty ideals into practice wasn't as easy as just writing them down on paper.
Exactly. It took time for those principles to really take root and for the institutions to function as intended.
It makes you realize that creating a new system on paper is one thing, but getting people to buy into it and make it work in the messy reality of everyday life, that's a whole different challenge.
Totally. And speaking of challenges, the notes point out that the Mexican Constitution was born out of a lot of tension and debate.
The classic clash of ideologies. What were the big dividing lines in this case?
Well, they talk specifically about the historical tension between liberals, who were all about individual rights, and conservatives, who were more focused on order and central authority.
It's fascinating how those same ideological battles have played out across cultures and throughout history, isn't it? And I'm guessing this tension is woven into the very structure of the Mexican Constitution.
You're exactly right. They go on to explain that the Mexican Constitution actually establishes three key systems: presidential, electoral, and federal. And each of these systems has its own functions and implications for how power is distributed and exercised in Mexico.
Okay, so we've got presidential, electoral, and federal. Let's break those down one by one. First up, the presidential system. What makes Mexico's presidential system stand out?
Well, unlike some other democracies that have a parliamentary system, Mexico, like the U.S., gives a lot of power to the president. The president is both the head of state and the head of government.
Okay, so a powerful president, but not a dictator, right? There are still checks and balances.
Right. Like in the U.S., the Mexican president is elected independently of the legislature, which means there's at least the potential for those two branches of government to keep each other in check.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the electoral system? How does Mexico choose its representatives?
Well, as you'd expect in a democratic republic, the Mexican Constitution lays out a system for choosing representatives through elections. And the notes really highlight this point, actually, emphasizing that these elections are meant to be free, authentic, and periodic.
So regular, fair elections are a cornerstone of the system.
Exactly. It's all about making sure that power is ultimately accountable to the people through the ballot box.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about this third system, federalism? What does that mean in the context of Mexico?
It means that power in Mexico is divided between different levels of government: the federal government, state governments, and then, of course, you have the government of Mexico City. And each level has its own responsibilities and areas of authority.
It's like a multi-layered cake of power, with each layer having its own flavor.
I like that. And the whole point of this layered cake, so to speak, is to prevent any one level of government from becoming too powerful. It's about striking a balance between national unity and regional autonomy.
So it's about ensuring that different voices and perspectives are represented in the decision-making process.
Exactly. And the Mexican Constitution goes into great detail outlining this federal pact, this division of powers and responsibilities between the different levels of government.
I bet those details matter a lot. The actual text of the Constitution really shapes how this whole system works, right?
It absolutely does. And it's worth noting that this federal structure was actually a major point of contention during the drafting of the Constitution. You had those who wanted a strong central government and those who wanted more power for the states.
So that tension between liberals and conservatives we talked about earlier, it was playing out right there in the creation of this system.
Exactly. It just goes to show you that these debates about how to structure power are ongoing, even within a single country's political system. And it speaks to the fact that constitutions aren't just dusty old documents. They're living frameworks that are constantly being interpreted, debated, and sometimes even amended to reflect the changing social and political realities of a country.
Okay, so we've got this picture of Mexico as a República Democrática Liberal de Derecho, as the notes put it. Can you break down what that actually means?
Sure, it translates to democratic liberal republic under the rule of law. It basically means Mexico aims to be a country where the people hold the power, where individual freedoms are protected, and where everyone is subject to the same set of rules.
It sounds like a pretty solid foundation for a just and equitable society. But how do those ideals play out in everyday life? That's what I'm really curious about.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one we'll definitely dig into more as we continue our deep dive. But I think it's important to appreciate the ambition and complexity of the Mexican Constitution. It's a document that grapples with those fundamental questions about power, freedom, and the relationship between the individual and the state.
Okay, you've definitely got me intrigued. Let's dive deeper into what it means to be a República Democrática Liberal de Derecho next.
Let's do it. It's a fascinating journey, so you're curious about how those big ideals actually work in everyday life in Mexico. Well, let's break down what it really means to be a República Democrática Liberal de Derecho.
Yeah, let's get into it. What does it really mean for Mexico to be a republic?
The notes make a really interesting point about this. They say a republic is only a thing of the people if everyone can actually participate. You know, it's not just about having a president instead of a king.
So it's more than just voting every few years. It's about citizens being actively involved in shaping how their country runs.
It's exactly. Active citizenship is key. And that can look like a lot of different things. Engaging in local politics, advocating for policies that matter to your community, making your voice heard.
Okay, so active citizenship is a big part of being a republic. What about that liberal part? What does that mean in the context of Mexico?
This is where the focus shifts to individual rights and liberties. The Mexican political system really prioritizes these freedoms and limits the power of the government to make sure those freedoms are protected.
So things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, these are all fundamental values in Mexico.
Absolutely. The notes even cite specific articles within the Mexican Constitution that guarantee those rights.
Wow, so these aren't just abstract ideas, they're woven into the legal fabric of the country.
It's a good reminder that constitutions have real-world consequences. They shape how people live their lives.
Okay, so we've got republic and liberal. Now what about that last part, de derecho, which I think means under the rule of law. Why is that phrase so important?
This is really the bedrock of any democratic society. It means that no one is above the law. Everyone, from everyday citizens to the president, is accountable to the same set of rules.
So it's about preventing abuse of power and making sure that everyone gets a fair shake.
Exactly. And the Mexican Constitution really drives this point home.
Yeah.
It states that the Constitution itself, federal laws, and international treaties, those are the supreme law of the land.
So it creates a clear system where everyone knows the rules and can hold each other accountable.
Now, here's a really interesting point that the notes make. It suggests that participating in the legal and political processes that uphold the rule of law is itself a form of democratic participation.
So it's not just about voting.
Right. It's about engaging with the system, serving on a jury, attending town hall meetings, staying informed about legal issues that affect your community. These are all ways to participate and make a difference.
That's such a powerful way to think about it. It's not just about those big moments like elections. It's about the everyday actions that shape our legal and political landscape.
Now, it's important to remember that while Mexico shares a lot of values with other democratic countries, it also has its own unique history and culture. And that shapes how these values actually play out in practice.
So it's about recognizing those shared principles, but also appreciating how they might look a little different in different contexts.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to democracy.
Yeah.
Every country's system develops in response to its own specific circumstances.
All this talk about Mexico's constitution and its democratic values really makes me think about those different forms of power we were discussing earlier. How do those pathways to power, force, inheritance, divine mandate? How do they